Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing Eyes Wide Shut. This film came out in 1999. It was directed by Stanley Kubrick. For those of you who are regular viewers, you know that I reviewed the film years ago, about 6 years ago to be exact, and you're probably wondering why I am reviewing it again, and that is because that review is a popular one, and it is kind of like a thorn in my side. I don't like to go back and watch reviews unless I need to for a purpose, but this is one of those that, yeah, like in hindsight, it has always been one that I don't care for, and I don't know what I was on when I reviewed it. Maybe it was the place I was in my life, the mood I was in, but I feel like I just kind of dismissed a lot of it and I wasn't quite grasping the intent properly at the time. And don't get me wrong, I've seen the film many times, and I've seen it a couple times since I reviewed it 6 years ago, and yeah, I don't know, I felt like it deserved a second review, one that I feel should be a bit more fair. Maybe you guys will disagree with it, I don't know. It was a film that had been really, really built up, and of course with the death of Stanley Kubrick, you know, it was just met with a lot of criticism, and other people saw it as a masterpiece. And it seems like over time more and more people are leaning more into it being a masterpiece, and quite honestly, a lot of people do consider it to be Stanley Kubrick's best work or his most interesting work. For me, I do think that it is a very intriguing and very engaging experience. And I think what I find most interesting about it, and I find this with a lot of Kubrick works, especially the more modern Kubrick films, I like that it is always shifting in my mind. It is like a mirage or like a diamond hitting the light, and the colors are always changing. It's always surprising you, no matter how many times you return to it. It is also one of those very elusive films as well, which perhaps that is the point of it. Very much like a dream, it feels very much like gold dust kind of slipping through your fingers. But also at the same time, there is a struggle to feel fully satisfied for me at the same time. And this is also one of those movies I never know where to rank it. I never know if I want to put it closer to the front, kind of more in the middle, more on the back side of the Kubrick canon. It's just a tough one. When I went back and watched my initial review for this film begrudgingly, I realized early on that I was taking the film, I think, far too literally. And I complained a lot about like the coldness of the movie initially, and how I found a lot of the sexual repression and the exploration of fantasy lacking any sort of palpable eroticism. I talked about the film feeling thin in terms of just, you know, its concepts and characters having very basic and undeveloped ideas about sex and love, and that made a lot of the film initially difficult for me to buy into. And I do understand when people see the film initially, maybe the first time or the second time, you know, because it had been built up so much and it had been so painstakingly and meticulously crafted, I can understand why people might be a little bit disappointed in it, or feeling like maybe it's a little bit simplistic, maybe a little bit aimless compared to his earlier works. But yeah, I do think also as you get older and the more you watch it and the more you're very familiar with the, you know, the environment and everything, it allows you to go a little bit deeper. And with this film, even though, yes, it is simple at first glance, it's very much kind of like a Rorschach type of experience. And you're really floating into some very weird areas of the brain, and you're never quite sure what's going on or what it means. You just kind of have to flow into it, I think. The film is, of course, about a married couple played by, at the time, real-life married couple, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. And, you know, perfectly cast. They're meant to be very well-off, very good-looking people. He is a successful doctor, she is a stay-at-home mom, and they have a lovely daughter. But the film is opening up the ideas very early on about, you know, fidelity versus commitment, and where our minds can go once you've committed to somebody, where your spouse may not know all that type of stuff. And that liberation can be quite interesting and quite enticing, but also quite terrifying. Like the idea of fantasizing about another man or another woman in a marriage. You know, it is a concept, it is fairly common over time, especially when you're in a relationship with somebody a long time. But naturally still, the ego and the identity are very wrapped up in that, even if you want to deny it. And there can be kind of direct damage due to that, you know, based on social expectation or just based on primal expectation of a man and a woman. It's the very famous, wonderful scene where the two of them are stoned, and Nicole's admission to fantasizing about somebody else leads her husband down this tour of the subconscious, and he's traveling deeper and deeper into like what I consider kind of like this fun house of mirrors. His inability to face his ego is what keeps him from being able to even have a fulfilling fantasy. At least this is how I read it. Whereas Nicole is more in our peripherals. She is not the focus of the film. And I think that's very important because she kind of looms as this very powerful, piercing presence, and she has this soporific quality to her. And the cinematic power and charisma that she has is just so strong compared to her husband. And all of that I always think is very interesting. And also in Kubrick films, it's very common that there's a lot of mirroring from the first half to the second half. And we see this, especially in movies like Full Metal Jacket, a lot in a movie like Barry Lyndon. And yeah, I really love that because we kind of get to see the things that may or may not leak into our nightmares later on. And this could be anything, like in the beginning of the movie when Tom Cruise is, he's a doctor and he's, I guess he's testing his patient's breasts for cancer. And she's a very beautiful person. And naturally that image is going to conjure up something maybe later on in your nightmares, in the bowels of your subconscious. Or the two pretty girls that meet Tom at the party and they're very flirtatious and they're walking arm in arm with him and he's very flirtatious back and, mirroring all the ladies that we'll see at the Maxed party later on. And yeah, I think there are a million examples of these moments in the movie. And every time you see it, you notice more. And that is what Kubrick is known for, all those subliminal things kind of slipping their way into the frame, and it's in every inch, every detail. And somehow it is creating something a little bit deeper and sinking a little bit deeper into us than we think. It's like all the shame and repression and honesty beneath it all in these characters mixed with maybe their own childhood memories that we'll never have access to, traumatic adult memories that we'll never have access to, hidden memories you didn't know that you had that maybe you've locked away, and voila, you've got a movie like this. Because all of those things that are kind of swirling inside us that we rarely dig up, they do come out in unexpected ways, typically like when you sleep, when you dream. And sometimes when you wake up in a panic and you're scared and you're like, wow, like where did that dream come from? You'd be surprised at what your mind is capable of and how powerful it can be. And also how much life you've lived and all the things that you don't know that are just kind of looming in there. And there's all of that kind of ambiguity and gray area that we are kind of pouring in initially to the skeletal frame of the movie. And for me, there's enough guiding you in a specific direction, where each situation that Cruise finds himself in, I think it can be interpreted in all kinds of different ways, but each one is contributing to another aspect of his inner workings. Everything from like the desk clerk that is blatantly hitting on him, and it's this very kind of strange, funny homoerotic moment, to the rainbow costume shop where there's the insinuations of pedophilia, things that we never talk about, and yet once the seeds are planted, who knows where your mind can go. But I do think also it is reflecting something a little bit bigger than just the idea of one person's inner workings or the idea of one person's relationship. I think this is reverberating throughout the movie in different concepts. It's about class. It's about the power you may have to be able to get rid of your secrets. And I think that's the aspect of Eyes Wide Shut that people find to be the most interesting, the most compelling. It's not necessarily the marriage discussion, it's more kind of the discussion of those in power, those who hold all of the secrets. And this calls to mind secret societies, like Bohemian Grove type stuff, all the conspiracy theories that exist in our peripherals, and how all of that reflects a similar idea of mistrust, lack of communication, also repression, all of these sort of things that force us to be unable to connect to each other. And it is the slippery, very soporific feeling of this movie that I find to be so incredible. It's because we are, going beat for beat with Tom Cruise on this journey. And I talked about in my original review how it almost feels like a RPG. It's like a video game where you're going from place to place and trying to figure it all out. And yet it's the stuff that we don't see, that we're only told about, that I find to be the key to the whole thing. Like, when he comes home later on at night and Nicole wakes up and she's laughing and she had that crazy dream. I feel like that scene is kind of the key to exploring a lot of the sex and the fantasy versus the need to really connect. Exhibition and shame, the intrigue of it, wanting maybe to be seen, but at the same time being very desperate to cover up or whatever. And there's like a nightmarishness there, naturally. Humiliation, but stimulation. And all of this, I think, is reflected in her retelling. But what I love about it is, throughout his whole kind of need to find the fantasy, he feels so cold and so sterile and unable to connect to everything. And compared to his wife, who is very intense, and she has this instinct for truth and honesty in the way that she is discussing her dream. I see like the entire party and his whole need to find connection and fantasy. It's cold by design, because it is his struggle between repression and salaciousness, and his need to find some sort of connection, but also being trapped by, what is carnal desire. The ritual being very rigid, and the women kind of like making out with each other, but they have masks on. That whole sequence is just so hypnotic. Every time I see it, it just takes my breath away. It's just spectacular in ways that only Kubrick can do. It's like, even though he is so removed, I feel emotion from moments where there are no words, and it's so haunting. But I do think that it's very important that we end the film on Nicole's face, a very blunt and very intimidating expression as she says the final line. And it is a really, really brilliant line because it kind of sums up everything, like the bitterness, you know, the need for connection, sacrifice of identity in marriage, knowing too that you have to wake up and that reality is always waiting for you. Again, there's that bitterness, and it is the cornerstone to everything. And when I think about this movie in terms of how it makes me feel, I imagine myself somebody asking me to marry them. And it's like, you know, suddenly your life is about to change, possibly. And so just in, you know, a few seconds as you're waiting to give your answer, your life is flashing before your eyes. Whatever is buzzing in your mind at that moment, you will probably never tell anybody before you give your answer. But to me, this movie rests right in that moment. It's not only the things you can't say out loud, it's the things that you can't even conjure up because they've been buried so deeply in your mind, in your body. But as we all know, as Kubrick matured in years, his movies became quite different. They got more sparse narratively and they became more dense aesthetically. And there is something about that I find very interesting. It's like a new way of experiencing a film, especially at the time, and yet there's something about it that leaves me just a little bit empty personally. I almost feel like the soul of it and the intent gets lost through all of the meticulous details that he's working on. And I still stand by, you know, I prefer a movie like Lolita, and it's almost like he bookended his career with two movies that have kind of a similar concept, because that one is also, you know, tackling repressed sexual ideas in a seemingly very civil society. But it's the wit, it's like the implication, the subtle implications there, and the off-kilter humor that I find to be really fantastic. And I feel that the themes are coming across just more strongly and more pronounced there. But Eyes Wide Shut is just kind of at a very different end of that spectrum, I think. No matter what, the film fixates me, it challenges me, it even makes me emotional, and I can never quite understand why. And I rarely have moments where I can't really understand how I arrived at an emotion. And yes, of course, there are a million things to read about this movie. It's endlessly fascinating because of the mysteries surrounding the production and whether or not Kubrick was happy with the final product or not. You know, there are varying stories there. But I don't know, if I take away all that stuff and I just look at the movie for what it is and just knowing that it is a Kubrick work, not thinking about it beyond that, I don't know, I look at it as if, you know, you're giving the film to aliens, you know, and you're trying to describe something about the human experience, and this is what Kubrick is telling you. And whether or not you do think that this properly communicates the human experience, it's doing something that words certainly can't express. And I think that is the most powerful thing about Stanley Kubrick. It's the most universal thing, the most timeless thing about him. I certainly recommend this movie if you haven't seen it. And certainly if it's a movie that maybe you didn't care for, I think it's absolutely worth revisiting. Because yes, it might be perplexing, but it is so hypnotic, and it's something that I think doesn't leave your mind. But that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist. I do commission portraits and I sell prints of my work. If that is something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons who are wonderful. Guys, thank you so much for your support. If you are interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.